Rudericus Sanctus, in Spanish Rodrigo or Roderic, was a priest in Cabra in modern-day Spain during the 9th century, when the area was under the dominion of the Islamic Umayyad dynasty. Roderic had two brothers, one Muslim and one that was not a Muslim. Once, after his brothers began to fight one another, Roderic attempted to break up the fight. In rage, his Muslim brother falsely reported to the authorities that Roderic had converted to Islam. When Roderic maintained his loyalty to the Catholic Church by denouncing his conversion to Islam and denying that he had ever wanted to convert to Islam, he was accused of apostasy from Islam under the law of the land and sent to be executed by decapitation on March the 13th, 857. He would be one of the so-called Cordoban martyrs, a series of Christian martyrs that would face execution in Cordoba during the years of the 850s. For still standing by his religion, he became canonized as a saint and is known today as San Rodrigo. Now some greater context for this. Apostasy from Islam, called Ridda in Islamic jurisprudence, carried the death penalty, as apostasy was seen as a betrayal of the religion, of the state, and thus of the loyalty to the Islamic community and the Islamic authorities ruling Al-Andalus, the Muslim-dominated regions of the Iberian Peninsula. Islam, being the religion and thus ideology of power in Al-Andalus, meant that the legal systems, though allowing other parallel systems for the Christians and Jews to a limited degree, still were ultimately based upon understandings of the Islamic Sharia according to the Maliki tradition, which was the dominant tradition at this time on the Iberian Peninsula, and which demanded the death penalty for apostasy away from Islam, implemented by the powers that ruled Al-Andalus. Speaking about those powers, the powers in control being the Western Umayyads, who had previously been the caliphal dynasty that had controlled the Islamic world, but were now a remnant in the Western Islamic world on the Iberian Peninsula, and were in a precarious situation, having little support and being surrounded by enemies, both from within and from without, and thus had a need and a want to enforce the Sharia more strictly, as to uphold the legitimacy of being good Islamic rulers. At the same time with this also, the Umayyads had begun to adopt a stricter policy of trying to convert the people of Al-Andalus to Islam more forcefully, more than had been the case in the past. This in order to ensure greater loyalty from the subjects under the Umayyads' control, as they feared Christian rebellions and Christians aiding their enemies, such as the Franks, in potential invasions of Al-Andalus. So there existed reasons and incentives for the strict enforcement of the apostasy laws, which resulted in the death of Rudericus, due to the fact that religion and law became a tool that was used for personal conflict and enforced by the state, as the system facilitated getting personal revenge through accusing one of having converted away from Islam or having blasphemed against Islam. By accusing someone of having converted and then them denying it, as they held firm with their beliefs, they got killed for having apostatized by the court of Cordoba, and this was what happened to Roderic. Also, a priest as a convert would have been a great religious propaganda win for proving the superiority of Islam over Christianity. Conversely, if a priest like Roderic had denounced his conversion from Christianity to Islam, as he did by claiming that he had never converted to Islam, and that his Muslim brother had bore false witness against him publicly where everyone saw it, it would make Islam look less superior, and more importantly, make the authorities that ruled Al-Andalus look weak by potentially having let this priest reconvert without punishment. Thus it was better to save face and have him executed by the logic of that context. It should also be mentioned that Roderic was not alone, as other Christian martyrs had been executed for blasphemy and or having converted away from Islam. During the same decade, and more would come in the future too within the same decade. As the Cordoban martyrs were part of a greater context of persecutions of Christians in Al-Andalus that even would intensify later, and Roderic was just one of the victims of this series of persecutions. In this context of greater persecutions, Islamic laws against apostasy and blasphemy were laws to protect the political and legal religious order, but through a strict interpretation, with few exceptions, it also worked as a method to suppress the ruled people, who were still mostly non-Muslim Christians, and or other people that had opinions that were not in line with official religious dogma. And by creating insecurities with these sorts of applications of the laws, such as Roderic being killed due to a mere spat with his brother, and conflicting reports about having converted or not. Through legal insecurities like that, the Umayyads and the various people in authority associated with them in Al-Andalus, such as local Islamic scholars and judges, could create further incentives to convert to Islam and to conform to Islamic dogma, to the version of Islam promoted by the Umayyads, which was their specific interpretation of Maliki Sunni Islam. It also served as a method to remove people through legal means by accusing them of apostasy or blasphemy, which they for example did when they removed Saint Eulogius, another priest that had been highly critical of the Umayyad rulership on the Iberian Peninsula, and who got imprisoned and also executed for having aided apostasy and for blasphemy against the Holy Prophet Muhammad. In Roderic's case and context, it was mostly Christians that got accused of blasphemy and of having committed claimed apostasy away from Islam. Yet it should be said that the same laws applied to Muslims too, and similar examples of Takfir, of accusing a Muslim for being a non-Muslim, have been made throughout Islamic history, which has resulted in the death penalty and executions. For example, the most infamous example of this is probably the Mihna Inquisition that was instituted by the ruling Mu'tazilites in the Abbasid Caliphate, where enemies of the Mu'tazila were considered heretics and disbelievers, and were thus punished by torture and or execution from the period of 833 to 851. And these events were very close in time and even paralleled the earliest periods of the Cordoban martyr period. This period was generally actually pretty extreme in persecutions, and various religious groups within the Arabic Islamic world got persecuted during this period of the middle of the 9th century. But you also have later examples, with accusations of apostasy and blasphemy being used against Muslims in massive persecutions. For example, the Mamluk blasphemy repressions of the 13th century, where the Mamluks executed alleged blasphemers and sorcerers, rebels, political rivals and others, with charges often being trumped up. You also have the Hanafi, Maturidi, Sunni, Ottoman denouncements of the Mamluks and various Shafi'i Sunni imams as being kuffar or non-Muslims in the 16th century, as a part of their war against and takeover of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. So accusations of blasphemy and of apostasy are actually pretty common in Islamic history. In practice, in theory though, you aren't supposed to actually accuse others of apostasy without very firm rules, as there have existed various religious judgments against this from the very beginning of Islam, as well as a consensus about it, and there has also existed sources that have argued against calling others disbelievers without very good evidence for that. Like this hadith: إذا قال رجل لأخيه يا كافر فقد باع بها أحدهما. If a man says to his brother, you are an infidel, then one of them is right. As stated by the Prophet himself, false accusations of being an unbeliever, of having done apostasy, is tantamount to having done apostasy yourself. But this is in theory. In practice, accusations of apostasy and unbelief were used as a tool of power. Because when the political power rests upon religion, unbelief and accusations of it becomes thus a tool of power to remove people that were found to be problematic, or as a tool to enforce one's power over people. In the case of Roderic, however, it was not so much the greater power that caused his death, though the greater powers certainly were involved by carrying it out and taking the word of his brother over his. It was primarily his brother that did it over a rather petty dispute, as the system of religious ideology of power became a method for personal power and revenge. And Roderic's case is just a case in a greater pattern in human history, as it is very similar to how accusations of witchcraft in the past in Protestant Christian countries often were due to personal reasons, and in the Soviet Union and in many other sorts of modern dictatorial states. Accusations of not following the state ideology or breaking other taboos could and does lead you into jail and or execution, and thus was and is used in interpersonal conflicts between ordinary people. Most cases of blasphemy and other similar laws being brought into courts historically have not actually been big powers or the great rulers crushing dissent or even any sort of clear blasphemy or breaking of an ideological taboo, but by personal accusations, often being made due to personal slights and then acted upon by the big powers of the state, of the ruling power. The story about Roderic in context shows just how laws of apostasy and similar laws about deviating from the ideology of power have been used as a method of personal revenge and were used as a means of power in personal and political conflicts. And I hope you found this video about Saint Roderic in a greater context interesting. If you have any questions or other comments, please post them and I will respond.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة من فضلكم.